All right, today I'm going to be changing out the seals and the bearings on the John Deere final drive in the front. So the way these are set up is there's some bearings and some seals that are holding this all kind of in position, and there's a shaft that goes from the front axle down to the drive gear and the final drive behind this hub. So what's really common on these is the bushings and the bearings. So if you can see that play, it's hard to see that, but there's actually play in the upper part of the spindle area, and that's all just because there's a bushing and a seal and a bearing behind there that's just gone bad and needs to be changed. So usually the only time people pay attention to the final drive is when it leaks. So if it has a leak, usually you'll find that the seal on the bottom is gone on it. So when you're steering or going left and right with the final drive, it's leaking out of the final drive area where it connects into the axle through the spindle shaft. And that's kind of more down in this area here. So there's a seal behind this, and there's a couple bearings in here that really just keep the steering final drive from turning left and right, and it's all sealed, and there's a couple bearings. The bottom line is that this one here needs new bushing and bearing, and I'm going to do the seals while I'm in there. I'm actually going to do both sides, just because if this one's in need of change, the other side is pretty close behind as far as needing a change. So I'm going to take you through that today, and it should be relatively straightforward. First thing you want to do is I like to get the machine off the ground with some jack stands. I usually use the frame or the loader area to jack it up. Pull the tires off it, and when you pull the machine in, you can use the bucket to raise it off the ground. You don't have to jack this up with a car jack. Use the bucket, get the wheels off the ground, put your jack stands underneath it, pull the wheels, lower the machine on the jack stands. That's the first step. Once you do that, you can feel if there's any play in there, and you can fix it while you're in there. Okay, I've got the final drive completely off the machine. What I like to do is tilt the axle to the other side, which keeps all the oil in the axle on the other side, on the other final drive. So when you do this, if you have a little oil, it's going to drip out a little bit. So put your cardboard down first, and that way you're making a mess. And all you're going to do is you can pull this off by taking out the bolts. There's 4 bolts on the top. This holds the final drive in place, and it's just going to come right down. You can use a jack to lower it, that way it's not falling on the ground. I also took off the tie rod end. You don't have to do that, but I took that off. If you didn't take the tie rod end off, it would the top piece would just stay attached to it. I pulled it off to make it easier. So that's how you would get the final drive out. There's a gasket. It's a steel plate gasket that goes on top, and then there's 2 pins that should be there, or at least 1 pin should be there. This one, the pin is missing, which is a good indication that somebody's already been into this drive and done some work on it in the past. So, not a big deal, but there is definitely a pin that goes here. I believe there's 2 pins, one that goes here and one that goes there. So I'm gonna try to get the pins for it as well, and I'm also gonna try to change both the bushing on top, which is underneath here. There's going to be a bushing and a seal that goes in there, and it holds this whole thing tight in this area. And this is where the problem was. It's all in this area here. And if you were to look down here, there's a gear that comes in from the shaft, and then there's another gear that meshes at a 90-degree angle that's attached to the spindle on this vertical shaft. Those 2 mesh, and that creates a turn, which turns the final drive, which is another gear on the other side of this shaft with a big gear in the back of the hub. So all that is pretty common. All the tractors work like that, and they call that the knuckle, the final drive. There's a couple different ways you can name that, but there's basically a vertical shaft, which meshes with the axle, and it meshes with the spindle. So those are perpendicular to that vertical shaft, and they both run off the same exact gear, top and bottom. So a simple design. Obviously the backlash on that's important, because you don't want that to be out of tolerance, because you'll run into a sharpened gear eventually, and then again, eventually the gears will strip. So all this kind of has to be exactly where it needs to be in order to not damage any of those gears. That's really how most all tractors work on the front four-wheel drive, the front final drives. There's just 2 gears, and then there's you've got the final larger gear down here. Okay. Next step is to take the end of the axle housing cover off. So the way this comes off is super easy. You've got 4 bolts on the flange. Take the bolts out, and you're going to pull this right out. And if you look on the other side, there's just a bearing with a bunch of splines that connect into the gear, and the splines are going to connect into the shaft. And if you look in here, the next step is going to be to take that clip out. There's a big clip in there. There's actually a seal that's supposed to be in there. The seal is missing on this. So somebody who was in here didn't have the seal, obviously, and put it back together without the seal. That's why it's actually a bushing seal, and that's why there was so much play on the top of this spindle, or this final drive, because there was no bushing in there. So there's a big snap ring. You're gonna take the snap ring out, and you're gonna take that bearing out. And the best way to do that is to take this off of the machine, and it makes it much easier to work with. And this is just 4 bolts, and I'm also probably might change that bearing as well. Let's see though. This axle could come out. It just pulls right out. And on the other side, it's just the same thing. You've got similar connection. This is going into your differential. You just press it back in, push it back in if you don't want to have it outside the axle. And it just rests in there. So it's just a slide joint with the same connection on this side, on the differential, on the center of the axle. Just like a car, right? So that's how that works. Okay, snap ring is out. There's actually a washer that goes underneath the snap ring. And to get this out, you're just gonna use a pair of snap ring pliers. So you can get a medium-sized one. This is a larger, medium-sized one's fine. Little tip though, whenever you take a snap ring off any area of any hydraulic or mechanical equipment, there's always gonna, if the machine's been used for 1,000 hours or so, there's always gonna be a ridge. That snap ring is actually gonna leave a ridge behind in the groove, in the upper part of the groove. So if you look at the shaft area, see where that screwdriver is, that's the groove that the snap ring actually goes into and is held in place. Now the upper part of that, the top part of that area of where the snap ring's being held in, is going to develop a ridge because of the up and down movement, constant pushing and hitting up against that snap ring is going to mushroom the top part, the outer part of where the snap ring is being held in place. And that's true for hydraulic cylinders as well. So when you have a cylinder and there's a snap ring holding the outer cap in place, the rod seal retaining cap in place, it's going to create a ridge just because over time it's hitting up and down and pushing out on that ring. So if you try to get this bearing out and you can't get it out and it seems like it's just too tight, then what you're gonna have to do, or what I do, is take a little Dremel and take that Dremel and just scuff the ridge off, the ridge that's gotten created over time. And then when you do that, it'll be back to the same size as what this is machined at, the actual housing, and you'll get that bearing right out. And the way to get these out is to flip it over, and then you wanna take a socket extension. So you're gonna take your socket extension, obviously if you're vertical, and you put it through like this, and you're gonna take that flat part of the socket extension, and you're gonna push it up against that bearing, and you're just gonna tap around in a fashion, go around it, and you'll see the bearing start to work its way out, and eventually it'll get near the edge and be relatively easy and fall right out. Okay, the bearing is out. It just looks like this. It's a sealed bearing, so it's designed not so much for high speed, but just keeping the left and right of the spindle kind of where it needs to be. So like I said, you can use a ratchet extension, and you're pushing. What you're doing on the inside is you're just pushing like on the outside of it, and you want to change the position. So eventually this pushes this out. Pull that out, and in there's 2 gears. There's an axle gear, and then there's the vertical spindle gear, and they are just in there floating around, which is fine. Don't worry about it. They're both the same exact part number, same exact gear, so don't think you have to keep track of which one's which. You're gonna leave that bearing off when you go to put this back together, because that'll allow you to put those 2 gears where they need to be as you slide the final drive back on. So you're gonna eventually slide it back on, leave your bearing out until the end. But the first step now is just to get the rest of the bushings and bearings. Okay, I'm gonna pull the seal out of I'm gonna pull the lower seal out of the final drive, and what I like to do is take a rag and just twist it and then tuck it in between the shaft and the seal. This is just so that you don't lose, as you take this seal out, you're gonna lose little pieces of it, you know, as it falls apart. You don't want that to go down into the final drive. So take a little shop towel, just kind of twist it up and make a rope out of it, and then tuck it in between this area that's opened. That'll prevent it from falling apart and going in there. This is the new seal. It's gonna go in place, you know, when I pull that one out, it's gonna go in place right over that. This is just a regular seal. There's nothing fancy about this. So you're gonna take this out with a seal puller or a flathead screwdriver if you can get it underneath one side, and just use it in like a pry bar, pry it out. Okay, I got that seal out. The best way to get these out is take a screwdriver. I have an old flathead screwdriver that I took a grinder to it and made a U-hook shape out of the edge, and this works well to get underneath seals. So what you can do is take your screwdriver or your flat edge pry bar, and you want to collapse that seal in one spot. You can kind of see what I did. So if you look at it, I basically took the seal and I collapsed it in on one area. What that will do is it makes the seal smaller. Of course, if the seal's smaller, it comes out a lot easier because it's not really pressed in anymore. It's just resting in there. And then once you make it smaller, what you want to do is take your pry bar, get it in between the flange and the seal, and then just lift up, right? It's gonna pop right out. This is the old seal, and there's also a spring behind it on the oil side, so you wanna make sure you get the spring too if it comes off. Mine had come off. So the old seal on the spring, and then here's the new one with the spring behind it. And it's just gonna go right in place, just like that. And the way you get these in, you wanna get them in nice and even and flush. So if you have a seal socket or a seal tool, it's going to be a large socket that's going to be the same size as the outer diameter of the seal. And you're just going to take a mallet and you're going to tap it down, slowly, but very even. And as you tap it down evenly, the seal is going to go in just perfect, and it's going to be flush. Once it's in all the way, it's going to be flush with the housing here. Okay, so what I've done is I've gotten all my parts, and honestly, for this type of job, always get the John Deere factory replacement parts, because it's got to be, these parts have to be exactly right, especially if you're talking about gears and tolerances. You don't want to get aftermarket parts for something like this unless you absolutely have to. And if you go on to a lot of the John Deere suppliers sites, you can find all these parts in stock, and they will be shipped out in a couple of days, right to you. Or if you prefer, you can go down to your local dealer and they'll order them for you at probably the same price, and there's no shipping, obviously. So I've ordered up all my parts, all my seals. You can get the parts diagram on the John Deere site itself. You're gonna search for, this is a John Deere 2032R. I searched for it, and it has every part and every diagram I ever needed. So went ahead and got all the seals and the bearings that I felt I needed to change. This one also was missing the two posts that go in here, and these are really important, obviously, because these are going to hold this plate and the top assembly right where it needs to be. And honestly, it holds the entire spindle and drive assembly kind of right where it needs to be on the axle. So without these pins, it's really not going to be right. And this one, somebody had opened up this assembly, and these pins were gone. The upper bearing was missing. The upper seal was missing. So obviously, whoever took this apart did not take the time to put it back together with any parts. They just took it apart and then left it. They didn't order parts to fix it. So I went ahead, I put the seal in. So when you put a seal, I took the seal out earlier. When you put these seals in, you can do that with a large socket, right? But let's say you go to put the socket over the shaft, and it doesn't really reach. So what do you do? Well, the other way to get these on is take a piece of wood, a block of wood, and you can work your way around this slowly, right? You don't want to drive one side in all the way at one time. You want to work your way around this and drive this in evenly. You can even take the socket, is what I did. I took the socket and just worked my way around it, tapping it, and I would look and see what part of the seal was highest, and I would start with that side, and then as that part of the seal became even or a little lower, go to the highest side, and then eventually you get around this. Keep the socket flush on the flange here, and then once this seal is in all the way, it won't go down any further. And the way this is designed is it's supposed to stick up 1/16 of an inch, a little bit. It protrudes from the housing a little bit, and that's probably because when you put this on, this is a steel gasket that goes in between the two assemblies, the assembly and the cover itself. When you put this on, that rubber seal is now touching this this gasket, the steel gasket. So you wanna do it like that, and you wanna clean up all these surfaces because you don't want any clearance issues or any additional clearance in there, and that's gonna get you a perfect fit. And again, don't forget these two posts. These will come as a part if you order them. If you're missing these, I think it only comes with one from the factory, but I went ahead and put in two just to make it perfect. All right, now I'm gonna put the cover on the outer axle area. Again, I mentioned this earlier, don't put your bearing and your snap ring and your seal in there yet. Keep that out, because when you go to put this on with the final drive, you're gonna need to put your fingers in there and hold up one of those gears, and you won't be able to do that if you put that all together now. You wanna wait to do that. Also, the way this connects, there's an O-ring on this, so technically you don't need any gasket maker. However, in my case, one of the bolts was broken before I got into it. The previous person also broke a bolt on me and left it in there. I could grind that down and drill it out and put a bolt and a nut on that. I'm not gonna bother because this has quite a few bolts on it. It should be just fine. But what I did, and you don't need to do this because there's an O-ring already there, so you're not gonna have any leakage of oil. But just so I'm not doing this twice, because I do have one of the bolts missing, I put some gasket maker. This is the Black Magic Permatemp gasket maker, good for just oil. And I put a very, very thin layer and keep all the oil away from the inner part. So take your finger and scrape any excess off. You're not looking to create a lot of gasket maker on the surface here. This is just basically taking your finger and going around and keeping it all away from the area that has the O-ring, because the O-ring is gonna do all the work. But this is just in case the O-ring on mine leaks a little bit because I have one of the bolts missing. So you're gonna take that and you're gonna put it on there just like this. And then you're gonna have to line up the gear that's in there that goes on this spindle. There's two gears, one for this spindle and one for the vertical shaft, right? So you're gonna have to do that as you line this up and put the bolts on. Okay, I got that on there. Just enough gasket maker. I usually like to say when it squeezes out of the edges, you're looking at a 1/16 or less. And that's how you know you've put just enough and not too much. That's pretty much what I've got going on over here. You really can't tell, but there's about, a 1/16 of an inch only squeezing out all the way around. And I will wipe that off, later, but just to show that that's what you really want on this side. You can probably see it too. Just a little bit. If you have 1/2 inch squeezing out, that's way too much. And the problem with that is that if there's a 1/2 inch on the outside, you've got almost 1/2 inch or more on the inside, which you do not want that. You want the O-ring to do the work. This is just for backup. And again, my scenario, I have a broken bolt. So I've got 4 bolts on this, and the 5th one, which is in the front, is broken. So that's why as a backup, I put some gasket sealer on there. And you can see when you put the axle gear on, it's right there. It's over the splines. There's one of them over the splines, and one is just resting in there for the top part for later. And that's why you need to get your fingers in here to do all that. And you don't want to put that bearing and that seal on for that reason. Okay, next step is you're going to want to put the new bushing on the cover. So I'm going to show you first the order. So you've got this on the cover on the axle. You've got the gear on the axle. Splines are all lined up. The gear's on. There's one gear in there just floating around, and you have no seal, no bearing on there yet. So the bearing was going to go. This is not now, but I'm just showing you this because I have it all here. The bearing would go next. The washer with the ridge up goes second, and then your snap ring goes third. That is going to be put on after you slide the final drive into the housing using the jack, right? So that's what that's going to look like. Now at the end, when you go to put your final bearing on, it's going to be bearing, seal, and this goes on last. This is what holds on the final drive. This is what holds the final drive to the axle. And you want to take a look at this bushing here. The bushing I had on there was chewed up quite a bit, and I went ahead and pulled the old bushing off, and it comes off with a screwdriver or a pry bar. It's got like this rubber liner on the inside, so it's not hard to get this off. Take the old one off, put the new one on. When you do that, use a socket and just get a socket that's the same size as the bushing. Hit it pretty good, because this is gonna go on, but you have to hit it pretty good to get it on there. And that's it. You're gonna be fully assembled. You're gonna put that back on as a cover, which I will show you, what that looks like. But that's the overall high level order of putting everything back together again. Okay, I've got the final drive just pressed up against the axle, and it really goes on fairly easy. The whole trick with this is to use the jack, and you want to leave it loose enough when you get close to this area. You want to leave it kind of loose, and that way you can take the final drive and turn it left and right. And put a lot of oil, just regular motor oil is fine, on the seal, and then the bushing area that goes into the seal from this axle area. If you do that, everything that's new is a tight fit, of course, and it's all going to slide together really easily. So once you get it to go in, it's going to pop right in. It's really easy. And again, try to do something like this where, use a jack to do things like this if you have to lift something up, because you only have two hands. And what you can do is you can get it snug with the jack, not tight. You don't want to be forcing this in, because you don't want to ruin the brand new seal. When the bushing tries to go into the seal, it's not going to be exactly perfect, right? So you want to give it a chance. So get it where it's touching, not pushing on it, and then take your hands and take the whole final drive and turn it left and right, just like you were turning the steering wheel. That will actually work its way and find its way, and it'll just pop right in. Nothing to it, right? And then again, it looks like this from the top. There's a gear in there, you see that. So there's two gears that mesh, one coming from the axle and one from that vertical shaft, which is the spindle shaft. And they're just on there, and they're touching at the right clearances because there's a bearing. I haven't done any of these bearings yet. Haven't done the snap ring, nothing. This is all still out. So this is at the end. And if you don't wait to the end to put all this on, you will not be able to get this guy in. It'll be very difficult to do that. And so you want to put all this on at the end. Okay, I've got the inner bearing. I've got the washer with the flange facing up, and I've got the snap ring in there. That's what it should look like when you put those first three in. So you've got the inner bearing, you've got the washer with the bevel facing up on the inside, and then you've got a snap ring that holds it all kind of down, right? Right now, that is pretty much good to go. Next step is going to be to put the upper bearing on, right, and then put the seal over that. That's really what the final piece is going to use to keep it tight on top. These two pieces, believe it or not, were completely missing from this machine. So that's why there was just so much play in the upper part of that knuckle, or the final drive. And that was really the real reason why I started tearing this all down and looking at it. But that was missing completely, these two things. Okay, that's what the finished product should look like. You've got the upper bearing and you've got the upper seal in place, and it sticks up maybe a 1/16 of an inch. You're pretty much almost done with this side. I still have to put the top piece on, which is going to hold all this in place. And I've got pretty much everything set up the way you want it. You see the inner bearing down there and the shaft, outer bearing with outer seal. That lines up, I'll be honest with you, everything lines up absolutely perfect with the right parts. And that's kind of why I said earlier, if you're going to do this, just go and get the John Deere parts for it. It'll be well worth it. Okay, I've got both sides done on the final drive, and now what I'm gonna do is drain out the old fluid. This is what you wanna do at the end, because anything that was loose that fell in there, or you know, any old oil or debris that got in there, you can drain it. You're gonna drain this all out. You're gonna drain both sides completely, so the whole system should be empty. And then you're gonna fill it with fresh, fresh oil. Use the recommended oil from John Deere on all this stuff. You don't wanna use really anything different, because it's not really any cheaper. And if you use something too thick, it's just gonna take away from the machine's ability to do what it needs to do. So use what they suggest to use inside here. And it's probably just a gear oil of some sort. I think what I picked up was it's like a 90 weight gear oil, and that's the John Deere fluid that you get from them. So you're gonna go ahead and do that, and then when you fill it, you're gonna fill it right to the spot on the dipstick on the axle, and then you will run the machine around the yard a little bit, and you want to look for any leaks. You shouldn't have any leaks on this. Most of the parts, actually all the parts I used here were all from John Deere. They fit absolutely perfect, and there was not an issue at all as far as putting things together. Total time is at least an hour on each side. So when you tear this down, the first side is going to be about an hour and a half, 2 hours. The second side is going to go a lot faster, because you already know what to expect for the procedures. But I think this project, if you are not comfortable doing some advanced mechanical things, I would recommend you don't attempt this yourself, just because you're going to have a hard time with a lot of the bearings not wanting to come out, or putting things back in and getting confused with the order and where things go. So if you're comfortable with tearing things down, looking at diagrams and trying to figure things out as you go, absolutely, this will be easy for you. If you're looking for an easy how to fix it yourself, this is definitely not one of those projects that you want to tackle yourself if you're not 100% comfortable with mechanics and figuring things out, and having to really look at diagrams to figure out how things go back together. I'm not saying you shouldn't attempt this, but if you can have your local dealer do it, or local tractor place do it, for, I don't know, maybe $500 a side, or less, maybe a little bit less, maybe less than $1,000, rebuild both sides, that would be, I think, fairly reasonable. I spent $200 or $300 in parts, and I put, let's say, 4 hours of labor. So you're looking at about $600-700 yourself, right? If you factor in $100 an hour in labor for yourself. So, for $700, and then you look at the dealer saying they want, 900, maybe 1,000, it's not really that bad, because they'll do it a lot faster, and they'll deal with all the headaches for you. So, if you want to attempt it, go for it. I don't want to discourage you, but at the same time, just be aware, this is not a just turn the switch type project and you're done. It's going to take some time.